The desert didn't care who you were. It stretched out forever, a killer painted in gold and red. And under that sun, a man was just a speck of dust waiting to blow away. A cowboy rode through that heat, his horse kicking up little puffs of grit with every step. He wasn't going anywhere in particular. He was just going away. Away from the towns, the noise, the people who looked at him funny. They called him the silent man, not mean, not slow, just quiet. He'd never known a woman's touch, not because he was ugly or cruel, but because he never tried. His world was the creak of saddle leather and the whisper of the wind, a world of silence he'd built around himself like a fortress. Then he saw the watering hole. It was a miracle, a slick of blue shimmering in the heat-baked earth. He swung down from his horse, his knees aching, and dipped his hat into the cool water. As he brought it to his horse's muzzle, he felt it, a pair of eyes on him. He looked up, slow and steady. She was standing on the other side of the pool, still as a statue carved from the red canyon rock. Her hair was in two long, black braids, her buckskin dress worn thin from the trail. But her eyes were on fire. They held a look that said she'd seen hell and wasn't impressed. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just watched him, like she was weighing his soul on a scale. The cowboy's hand, calloused and rough, tightened on the brim of his hat. In town, he knew the drill. Keep his head down, stay in the shadows, be the ghost everyone already thought he was. But out here, under that endless, empty sky, her gaze felt different. It didn't just see him, it pierced right through him. She was Apache. He saw it in the proud set of her jaw, the beadwork on her moccasins, the weariness in her frame that hadn't bent her spine. He knew the stories, the bloodshed, the hate between their worlds. But looking at her, none of it mattered. There was no fear in her eyes, and he felt no fear in his heart. They were just two lost souls, washed up on the shore of the same dusty sea. She took a step toward him, then another. Her movements were smooth, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of her dark hair across her face. He opened his mouth, thinking he should say something, anything. But the words were gone, lost in the desert of his throat. He'd never been a talker, especially not with a woman. But then she spoke. Her voice was strong, but underneath it, he heard a tremor, a crack in the armor. "Will you let me ride with you under the burning sun?" The question hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. He just stared, his mind racing. No one, man or woman, had ever asked to ride with him. They rode away from him. They whispered about the lonely rider who talked to his horse more than to people. To hear this woman, this Apache girl with fire in her eyes, asked to share his trail, it was impossible. He searched her face for a trick, for mockery, for some cruel joke he didn't understand. There was none. All he saw was a desperation that mirrored his own. A loneliness so deep it had turned to steel. She wasn't asking for a ride. She was asking for refuge. The desert held its breath. Even the cicadas went quiet. He swallowed, the sound loud in the sudden silence. His voice came out as a rusty croak. I don't even know your name." A flicker of something, not quite a smile but close, touched her lips. "Names are for when they're needed," she said, her voice low and steady. "Right now, all I need is to ride." He was caught, trapped between a lifetime of solitude and the raw, untamed hope in her eyes. Taking her with him was a fool's errand. It meant trouble. It meant danger. It meant breaking every unspoken rule of the West. But leaving her behind, that felt like a bigger risk. He looked into her eyes one last time, and what he saw there made his decision. He saw a truth so pure and unguarded, it stole his breath. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His throat was tight, but the words came out, quiet as a prayer on the wind. "Then ride with me." She stepped forward, her hand brushing his saddle as she swung up behind him. Her touch was like lightning, and in that single searing moment, his entire world tilted on its axis. Nothing would ever be the same. The horse grunted under the new weight, but she settled behind him as if she were born to it. Her movements were fluid, graceful, even after a long day under that punishing sun. He could feel the warmth of her body against his back, a sensation so foreign it made every muscle in his body tense up. He'd spent a lifetime keeping the world at arm's length. Now she was closer than his own shadow. Her breath was a soft, steady rhythm against the back of his neck. They rode on, the beat of the hooves a steady drum against the silent earth. The landscape didn't change, still just dust and heat and endless sky. But inside him, a tectonic shift was happening. The loneliness that had been his only companion for years was suddenly crowded. She didn't talk much. Her silence wasn't like his, born of isolation and hurt. Hers was the silence of a hunter, of someone who watches and listens and understands the world in ways he never had. She saw a hawk circling on a thermal he hadn't noticed. She pointed to the nearly invisible tracks of a javelina in the hard-packed dirt. She could smell rain on the wind hours before the clouds gathered. He found himself listening, truly listening, for the first time in a long time. She spoke of the desert not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living thing to be respected. And as she spoke, he found his own voice, rusty and rough, telling her about things he'd never told another soul. About the long, brutal cattle drives, about the stars on a moonless night, about the fever that took his family when he was just a boy. She listened without judgment, her stillness a comfort he'd never known. That night they made camp under a rocky overhang. He built a small fire, the flames dancing in her dark, watchful eyes. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, and he took the time to really study her. She was younger than he'd first thought, but her gaze held the wisdom of 100 years. He saw the faint silvery lines of old scars on her arms, and he knew, without her saying a word, that she had fought battles he couldn't even imagine. He realized then that her question at the watering hole wasn't just a question. It was a plea, and he had answered it. Now, whatever she was running from was running after them both. As they settled down for the night, a new thought struck him, cold and sharp. He'd been so focused on her, he hadn't considered the most obvious danger. Maybe she wasn't running from something. Maybe she was leading something right to him. The thought coiled in his gut like a rattlesnake. He glanced over at her, wrapped in her thin blanket, her breathing deep and even. She looked peaceful, harmless, but the West was full of harmless-looking things that could kill you. He had survived this long by trusting no one, and in a single afternoon, he had broken his own cardinal rule. He lay awake for hours, his hand resting on the Colt by his side, listening to the night sounds. Every coyote howl, every rustle in the sagebrush, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a fool, a lonely, desperate fool who had let a pretty face and a sad story cloud his judgment. He finally drifted off into a restless sleep, only to be jerked awake by a sound that wasn't natural. It was the soft, almost silent click of a rifle hammer being cocked. His eyes flew open. In the dying embers of the fire, he saw her. She was standing over him, and in her hands was his Winchester rifle, aimed directly at his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to draw his pistol, to fight. But he was frozen, pinned by her unblinking stare. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, making it impossible to read her expression. Was this it? Was she going to rob him? Kill him for his horse and supplies? His mind reeled. The kindness, the shared silence. Was it all a lie? He stared down the barrel of his own rifle, the cold, dark circle of the muzzle looking like the entrance to a tomb. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. She didn't answer. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle stock. Her focus was absolute. He followed her gaze, looking past his own body, out into the deep darkness beyond their campsite. And then he heard it, a low guttural growl from the shadows. He'd been so focused on her, the human threat, that he'd completely missed the real one. A pair of luminous yellow eyes blinked open in the darkness, not 20 feet away. A mountain lion, big, hungry, and silent. It had been stalking them, waiting for them to sleep. The cat let out another growl, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. It gathered its powerful hind legs, ready to spring. He didn't have time to think. didn't have time to reach for his Colt. Crack! The rifle shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash lit up the night, and the recoil barely seemed to move her. The mountain lion, in mid-leap, convulsed and dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and ozone. She lowered the rifle, her movements calm and economical. She worked the lever, ejecting the spent cartridge, her eyes never leaving the darkness where the cat had fallen. He slowly sat up, his body trembling with leftover adrenaline. He looked from the dead predator to the woman standing over him. She hadn't been aiming at him. She had been protecting him. She had saved his life. He felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost made him sick. He had been ready to believe the worst of her, to see her as a threat, when all along she had been his guardian. She finally looked down at him, her dark eyes searching his. "The wind carried its scent," she said, her voice quiet. "You were sleeping too soundly." He had no words. He just stared at her, this enigma of a woman who was more at home in this brutal wilderness than he would ever be. He had offered her a ride, a simple kindness, and she had repaid him by saving him from a violent death. The balance between them had shifted. He was no longer just the man with the horse. He was in her debt. She handed the rifle back to him, the barrel still warm. "We should move," she said. "The shot will attract others." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He got to his feet, his legs still unsteady. As they packed up their meager camp in the pre-dawn gloom, he couldn't stop looking at her. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? And what kind of trouble was she in that made a mountain lion seem like the lesser of two threats? He knew one thing for sure. Their journey together was no longer a simple ride. It was a matter of survival. And he was beginning to suspect that he needed her far more than she needed him. They rode hard for the rest of the night, putting as much distance as possible between them and the sound of that rifle shot. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, offering little light, but she navigated the darkness as if it were broad daylight, guiding them through treacherous, rocky terrain with an unerring sense of direction. He just held the reins and trusted her. It was a new feeling for him, putting his life in someone else's hands. It was terrifying, and somehow it was liberating. When the sun finally began to bleed across the eastern horizon, painting the clouds in shades of pink and orange, she finally called a halt. They found a small, hidden box canyon, a natural fortress of red rock that would hide them from prying eyes. They were both exhausted, running on pure adrenaline. He slid off the horse, his body a collection of aches and pains. She dismounted with a grace that defied her obvious fatigue. He set about building a small, smokeless fire while she surveyed their surroundings, her eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim. There was a tension in her, a coiled readiness that hadn't been there before. The night's events had stripped away any pretense. They were no longer just two strangers sharing a trail. They were allies in an unspoken war. As the fire began to crackle, he finally found his voice. "Thank you," he said. The words felt small, inadequate for the debt he owed her. She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Survival is not a debt," she said simply. "It is a shared burden." He nodded, understanding her meaning. Out here, you looked out for each other, or you died. It was that simple. But something told him her troubles ran deeper than just the natural dangers of the desert. "Who are you?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them. She stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "My name is Chayton," she said. Her voice was soft, but the name itself sounded strong, powerful. "It means falcon." "Chayton," he repeated, trying the name out. It suited her. "I'm Jake." He felt foolish for not having offered his name sooner. It was the first time he'd said it to anyone in months. She gave a slight nod, accepting it. "The men who are following me," she began, and his head snapped up. So he had been right. There were men. "They are not from my tribe. They are white men, led by one who calls himself the Colonel." A cold dread seeped into Jake's bones. He'd heard whispers of the Colonel, a former cavalry officer, disgraced and discharged, who now led a band of ruthless mercenaries. They were killers for hire, known for their brutality and for leaving no witnesses. "What do they want with you?" Jake asked, his voice low. Chayton reached into a small leather pouch at her waist. She hesitated for a second, her eyes locking with his, as if making a final judgment about his character. Then she pulled out an object and held it out to him. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't gold. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. A falcon, just like her name. It was beautiful, clearly ancient, the wood worn smooth by the touch of countless hands. But as he looked closer, he saw something else. The bird's eyes weren't wood. They were tiny, uncut stones that glittered in the firelight. Diamonds. Raw, priceless diamonds. Jake stared at the carving, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't just a trinket. This was a fortune. Enough to make a man king of his own territory. Enough to make men kill without a second thought. "It is the eye of the ancestors," Chayton said, her voice barely a whisper. "It has been the sacred heart of my people for generations. The colonel and his men slaughtered my family to get it." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Slaughtered her family. The weariness he'd seen in her eyes, the scars he'd imagined. They were real. He was looking at the sole survivor of a massacre. She had not just been running. She had been avenging. And he, Jake, the silent man, the loner who avoided trouble at all costs, had just ridden right into the middle of it. The colonel wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth for a prize like this. And now he would be hunting them both. Jake handed the wooden falcon back to her, his hand trembling slightly. The weight of it, the history and the blood spilled over it, felt immense. He was a simple man. He herded cattle, he kept to himself. He was not a warrior, not a hero. What could he possibly do against a monster like the colonel? His first instinct was to run, to tell her he was sorry. But this wasn't his fight. He could leave her the rifle, some supplies, and ride away. He could disappear back into the desert and be the ghost he'd always been. No one would blame him. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then he looked at her. He saw the grief etched on her face, the fierce, defiant pride in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. She had lost everything, and still she fought on. She had trusted him, a complete stranger, not just with her life, but with the sacred heart of her people. How could he abandon her now? Leaving her would be a betrayal worse than any bullet. It would mean that his silence, his solitude, wasn't a choice. It was cowardice. "He will not stop," Chayton said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "He believes the falcon will lead him to the lost canyon of gold." Jake frowned. "The what?" "It is an old legend, a myth our elders tell the children, that the ancestors hid a great treasure in a secret canyon, and the falcon is the key." "Is it true?" Jake asked, his curiosity overriding his fear for a moment. A sad smile touched Chayton's lips. "It is just a story. The true treasure is the falcon itself, our connection to those who came before. But the colonel, he believes the story." So that was it. A bloodthirsty maniac was chasing a ghost story, and Chayton was caught in the middle. Jake looked at his hands. They were calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but they weren't the hands of a gunslinger. He'd fired his pistol in self-defense a few times, but he was no match for a band of trained killers. But he had his horse, he had his rifle, and he knew the desert. More importantly, he had Chayton. She was the real weapon. She knew how to survive, how to fight, how to disappear into the landscape like a wisp of smoke. Maybe, just maybe, together they stood a chance. It was a fool's hope, but it was better than no hope at all. He took a deep breath, the dry desert air filling his lungs. He made his choice. "Then we don't let him find us," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We'll lead them on a chase through the Badlands, places their horses can't go. We'll wear them down." A flicker of surprise, of gratitude sparked in Chayton's eyes. It was more rewarding than any gold. "The journey will be dangerous," she warned. "More dangerous than the lion." "I reckon I'm starting to get used to danger," he replied, a hint of a smile on his face. For the first time since he met her, he saw her truly smile back. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of grief for a fleeting moment. It was like seeing the sun rise after a long, dark night. They spent the day resting, conserving their strength, letting the horses graze on the sparse vegetation in the canyon. They spoke in low tones, planning their route. Chayton would describe a landmark, a twisted spire of rock, a dried-up riverbed, and Jake would consult the crude map in his head, plotting the most difficult, punishing path he could think of. They were a team. The thought was strange, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, Chayton suddenly went still. She put a hand on his arm, her touch electric, and pointed toward the canyon mouth. "Riders," she whispered. Jake's heart leaped into his throat. He squinted into the failing light. She was right. A group of at least 5 men on horseback were silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They hadn't shaken them. The colonel's men were here. They were trapped. The canyon had high, sheer walls on 3 sides. The only way out was the way they came in, straight into the guns of the mercenaries. They had nowhere to run. The figures at the canyon mouth were still just silhouettes, but Jake could feel their menace even from this distance. They weren't moving recklessly. They were fanning out, methodical and patient, preparing to sweep the canyon. They knew their prey was cornered. "The back wall," Chayton hissed, grabbing her small pack. "There's a fissure. It might lead up." Jake looked where she was pointing. The canyon wall looked like a sheer, unclimbable cliff face. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A dark, jagged crack running from the base almost to the top. It wasn't a path. It was a scar in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "The horses," he said, his voice tight with panic. "We can't leave the horses." "We have no choice," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She strode over to his horse and gave it a sharp slap on the rump. Then she did the same to her own mount. The startled animals galloped out of their hiding spot, heading towards the mouth of the canyon. It was a brilliant, desperate move. The riders would see the horses and assume they were trying to break out. It would buy them a few precious moments. "Come," she commanded, already scrambling toward the fissure. Jake grabbed his rifle and canteen and followed, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The rocks were sharp, tearing at his hands and clothes. He could hear shouting from the canyon mouth now, followed by the thunder of hooves as the mercenaries gave chase to the riderless horses. The fissure was even narrower up close. It was a claustrophobic, vertical tunnel of stone. Chayton slipped inside without hesitation and began to climb, finding handholds and footholds that were nearly invisible. Jake followed, his broader shoulders scraping against the rough rock. It was a brutal, exhausting climb. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest. Loose gravel cascaded down past him as Chayton climbed above, and he prayed that the mercenaries wouldn't think to look up. They were halfway up the cliff face when a gunshot echoed through the canyon. Then another. They were shooting the horses. A wave of cold fury washed over Jake. There was no reason for it. It was cruelty for its own sake. He gritted his teeth and kept climbing. After what felt like an eternity, he saw Chayton pull herself up and over the rim. A moment later, her hand appeared, reaching down for him. He grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong, and she helped haul him the last few feet onto the flat mesa top. He collapsed onto the dusty ground, gasping for air, his body trembling. They were exposed up here, but for the moment they were safe. They had escaped the trap. Below them they could hear the angry shouts of the colonel's men. They had been outsmarted, and they were not happy about it. "They'll come after us," Jake gasped, looking back at the dark fissure. "Yes," Chayton said, "but the climb will slow them, and up here the land is my ally." They pushed on, moving as quickly as they could across the rocky, uneven surface of the mesa. The sun had set, and a full moon was rising, bathing the landscape in an ethereal, silver light. It made for treacherous footing, but it also meant they could travel without a lantern. They walked for hours, a grim, silent procession. The initial relief of their escape had worn off, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They were on foot, with limited water and no food, in the middle of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. And behind them, a pack of ruthless killers was on their trail. Jake stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock. He went down hard, his rifle clattering against the stone. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his ankle. He cried out, biting back a curse. Chayton was at his side in an instant. Her gentle hands probed his boot. He sucked in a sharp breath as she touched the swelling ankle. "It's sprained," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Maybe broken." Jake's heart sank. A sprained ankle out here. It was a death sentence. He couldn't walk on it. He would slow her down. "Go on without me," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You can travel faster alone. Take the rifle. You have to protect the Falcon." He expected her to argue, to protest. Instead, she was silent. She looked at him, her face unreadable in the moonlight. Then she looked back the way they had come, toward the unseen but ever-present threat of the colonel. He saw the conflict in her eyes. She knew he was right. Her mission, the protection of her people's sacred relic, was more important than the life of one man. Logic demanded she leave him. "I will not leave you," she said finally, her voice low but firm, cutting through the cold night air. "You have to," he insisted, pushing himself into a sitting position. "They'll catch us both." "Then they will catch us both," she replied, her gaze unwavering. She reached out and placed a hand on his cheek. Her touch was warm, a startling point of heat in the coldness of the night. "You did not abandon me at the watering hole. I will not abandon you on this mesa." Her loyalty, her fierce, stubborn refusal to leave him, struck him deeper than any bullet could have. In that moment, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed him. It was more than gratitude, more than admiration. It was something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. But their moment was shattered by a sound that made their blood run cold. A whistle, high and sharp, echoing across the mesa from the direction they had come. It was a signal, and a moment later, it was answered by another whistle, off to their right, and then another to their left. They hadn't just followed them up the cliff. They had split up. They were flanking them. The hunters were closing their net. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Jake. They were on a flat, open mesa with nowhere to hide. His sprained ankle made him a liability, an anchor dragging Chayton down with him. They were caught, but Chayton's face was a mask of calm determination. She scanned the moonlit landscape, her eyes missing nothing. "There," she whispered, pointing to a dark shape in the distance. "A rock formation. We can make a stand there." "Make a stand?" Jake echoed in disbelief. "It's 2 of us against 5 of them." "Then the odds are almost fair," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress and began to bind his ankle, her movements quick and efficient. The binding was tight, providing a surprising amount of support. "Can you walk?" "I can limp," he said, gritting his teeth as she helped him to his feet. The rock formation was farther than it looked. Every step was agony for Jake, but he leaned on Chayton, and together they stumbled through the darkness. The whistles of the colonel's men grew closer, a chilling, predatory sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were being herded like cattle to the slaughter. They reached the rocks just as the first figures appeared on the horizon behind them. It was a jumble of massive, wind-scoured boulders, forming a natural, defensible position. They scrambled into the center of the formation, finding cover behind a large, flat slab of granite. Jake checked his rifle. He had a full magazine. He pulled out his Colt, checking the cylinder. 6 shots. It wasn't nearly enough. "How many rounds do you have?" he asked Chayton. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened her small leather pack. Jake expected her to pull out a pistol, maybe a knife. But what she took out made his jaw drop. It was a bow. Not a large hunting bow, but a small, powerful-looking bow made of dark, polished wood and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. It was a weapon of her people, ancient and deadly. She knocked an arrow, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. She peered through a gap in the rocks, her breath steady, her focus absolute. The mercenaries were closer now, advancing cautiously, using the sparse cover of the mesa to their advantage. Jake could see the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel. "They'll rush us," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let them," Chayton replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. The first shot came from their left. A bullet ricocheted off the rock above Jake's head, sending stone chips flying. He instinctively ducked, his heart pounding. He raised his rifle, trying to get a beat on the muzzle flash, but the man was gone, already moved to new cover. Another shot, this one from the right. They were trying to pin them down, to surround them completely. Jake fired back, aiming at the last place he saw movement. The shot was loud, a defiant roar in the night, but he knew he hadn't hit anything. He was just wasting ammunition. Then Chayton let out a soft hiss. It was the sound of her arrow leaving the bow. There was no loud crack, just a whisper of sound. It was followed a second later by a choked cry from the darkness and the sound of a body hitting the ground. One of them was down. Jake stared at her in amazement. She had made an impossible shot in near darkness with a bow and arrow. A furious volley of shots erupted from the mercenaries' positions. Bullets whined and sparked off the rocks around them, forcing them to keep their heads down. They were angry now. "They will be more careful," Chayton whispered, already knocking another arrow. The fight settled into a tense, deadly rhythm. The mercenaries would fire, trying to draw their attention, while another man tried to creep closer. Jake would fire his rifle, providing cover, while Chayton would wait, patient as a spider, for one of them to make a mistake. Another hiss from her bull, another strangled cry. Two down. The remaining three mercenaries became even more cautious. The shooting stopped. An eerie silence fell over the mesa, broken only by the wind. "What are they doing?" Jake whispered. "Waiting for the sun," Chayton replied. "In the daylight, we have no advantage." She was right. Once the sun rose, their small fortress of rocks would become a tomb. The mercenaries could pick them off from a distance with ease. They had to do something before then. Hours passed. The moon began to sink toward the horizon. Jake's ankle throbbed, and a bone-deep exhaustion was setting in. He knew he couldn't stay awake much longer. Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness, startling them both. "The girl!" The voice was deep, gravelly, and full of command. It had to be the colonel. "Give us the girl and the wooden bird, and the man can walk away. You have my word." Jake looked at Chayton. Her face was set like stone. "Don't listen to him," Jake said. "His word is worth nothing." "I know," she said. "We give you one chance." The colonel's voice boomed again. "Throw out the falcon, and we might let you both live to see the sunrise." Chayton clutched the small pouch at her waist. Jake could see the torment in her eyes. The falcon was everything to her, but their lives were hanging by a thread. Then an idea, desperate and insane, began to form in Jake's mind. "Give it to me," he whispered to Chayton. "What?" "The falcon. Give it to me." He explained his plan in a frantic, low voice. It was a wild gamble, a 1 in a million shot, but it was the only shot they had. Chayton stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She pressed the sacred carving into his hand. Its smooth, worn wood felt warm against his skin. Jake took a deep breath. "All right, Colonel," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You want it? Come and get it." He then did something completely unexpected. He stood up. He stepped out from behind the cover of the rocks, into the open moonlight, holding the wooden falcon high above his head for them all to see. The remaining mercenaries were stunned into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Jake stood there, a perfect target, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. He was counting on their greed, on their obsession with the small wooden bird in his hand. "Shoot him!" the colonel roared, breaking the spell. A rifle cracked, and a bullet zipped past Jake's ear, so close he felt the heat of its passage. That was the signal. As Jake had planned, Chayton burst from the other side of the rock formation. While all eyes were on Jake and the falcon, she sprinted into the darkness, a fleeting shadow against the moonlit ground. She was running in the opposite direction, toward the edge of the mesa. It was a desperate gambit. They would split up. One of them had to survive. One of them had to get the falcon to safety. Jake dove back behind cover as another shot rang out. He had bought her a few seconds, but it wouldn't be enough. "Forget him! Get the girl!" the colonel yelled. He knew the falcon was the true prize. Jake risked a look over the rock. Two of the men were now running after Chayton, their dark forms closing the distance with alarming speed. The colonel remained behind, his rifle aimed squarely at Jake's position, pinning him down. Jake knew he had to do something. He couldn't let them catch her. He fired his rifle at the running men, not trying to hit them, but just to make them hesitate, to slow them down. One of them stumbled, returning fire wildly, but it wasn't enough. They were too fast. Chayton was fast, but she wouldn't be able to outrun them for long. He watched in horror as one of the men tackled her, bringing her down hard. She fought back with a ferocity that was breathtaking, but the man was bigger and stronger. The second mercenary was on her in a moment. A cry of despair escaped Jake's lips. His plan had failed. He had gotten them both captured. The two men hauled a struggling Chayton back toward the colonel. They threw her on the ground in front of him. One of the men snatched the small leather pouch from her waist, but it was empty. The colonel strode over to Jake's position, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "Your little trick is over, cowboy," he sneered. "Now be a good boy and toss me that bird." Jake was trapped. If he gave them the falcon, they would kill them both. If he didn't, they would kill Chayton in front of him. He looked at Chayton. She was on her knees, her head held high, her eyes blazing with a defiant hatred. Even now, defeated and captured, she was unbroken. And in her eyes he saw a message, a silent, desperate plea. He looked down at the wooden falcon in his hand, the eye of the ancestors, the key to a mythical canyon of gold, the sacred heart of a people. He knew what he had to do. With a roar of desperation, he raised his arm and threw the falcon. But he didn't throw it to the colonel. He threw it with all his might out into the darkness, over the edge of the mesa, into the deep black canyon below. The small wooden bird sailed through the air, a dark arc against the star-dusted sky, and then it was gone, swallowed by the abyss. For a moment, there was a stunned, absolute silence. The colonel and his men stared at the empty space where their prize had been, their faces a mixture of disbelief and incandescent rage. They had lost. Their fortune, their reason for all this bloodshed, was gone forever, lost in the bottom of a canyon 1,000 feet deep. The colonel slowly turned his head, his eyes locking with Jake's. The look in them was not just anger. It was the look of a man whose soul had been ripped out, leaving nothing but a cold, empty void of pure hatred. "You will die for that," the colonel whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. "Both of you, but not quickly." He raised his rifle, taking careful aim not at Jake, but at Chayton. But before he could pull the trigger, something impossible happened. The ground began to shake. A low, deep rumbling sound filled the air, growing louder and louder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something else. It sounded like thunder, the thunder of 1,000 stampeding hooves. Jake looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Pouring over the edge of the mesa, their forms dark against the first light of dawn, was a wave of riders. Dozens of them. They were armed not with rifles, but with bows and lances. Their faces were painted for war. They were Apache warriors, and at their head, riding a magnificent painted stallion, was a tall, grim-faced man with the bearing of a king. Chayton scrambled to her feet, a cry of disbelief and hope on her lips. "Father!" The warriors descended on the stunned mercenaries like a force of nature. It wasn't a fight, it was a reckoning. The colonel and his two remaining men were overwhelmed in seconds, their rifle shots drowned out by the war cries of the Apache. Jake could only watch, dumbfounded, as the chaotic scene unfolded. Chayton ran to the lead warrior, her father, and they embraced. The chief held her tight, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. When the dust settled, the two surviving mercenaries were bound and captive. The colonel lay on the ground, his life ended by an Apache lance. Justice, swift and brutal, had been delivered on the mesa top. Chayton and her father walked over to where Jake was still leaning against the rock, his mind reeling. The chief was an intimidating figure. His eyes were as sharp and fierce as his daughter's, and he studied Jake with an intensity that seemed to strip him bare. "You are the man who rode with my daughter," the chief said. It was not a question. "I am," Jake said, finding his voice. "You protected her, and you protected the sacred relic of our people, even at the cost of its loss," the chief said, his gaze drifting toward the edge of the cliff. Jake shook his head. "I just tried to do the right thing." The chief looked at Chayton, and a silent conversation passed between them. Then he turned back to Jake. "My daughter has told me that you carry a great silence within you," the chief said. "My people have a saying. The loudest truths are spoken in the quietest hearts. You have proven this to be true. You are welcome in our lands. You have a home with us, if you choose it. It was an offer that stunned Jake speechless. A home, a people, everything he had never had. He looked at Chayton. Her eyes were shining, not with tears of sorrow, but with something new. Hope, a future. He realized that his journey was over. The lonely cowboy who rode away from everything had finally found something to ride toward. But then, one of the captured mercenaries, a wiry, rat-faced man, started laughing. A high, unhinged cackle. "You fools!" he spat, his eyes wild with a mad glee. "You think you've won? You think that little bird was the real prize?" Everyone turned to stare at him. "The colonel wasn't a fool," the man cackled. "He knew the legend was real. He didn't need the bird. He had something better." Chayton's father stepped forward, his expression grim. "What are you talking about?" The mercenary grinned, showing broken yellow teeth. "Before he ever came after you, he found the old shaman, the one your tribe cast out years ago. Tortured him for days. The old man finally broke. He drew him a map right to your precious canyon of gold." The chief's face went pale. "The colonel sent that map off with our fastest rider 2 days ago," the man continued, his laughter growing louder. "Right to his employer, the railroad baron, Mr. Silas Croft. By the time you get back to your lands, he'll be there with 100 men, ready to claim what's his. The falcon was just a trinket. The real prize is the gold. And you led us right to it." A chilling realization washed over Jake. They hadn't won. They had just been a distraction. The entire chase, the massacre, the hunt, it was all a sideshow while the real theft was happening. They had saved the falcon, only to lose everything else. The victory on the mesa turned to ash in their mouths. The chief, a man of immense presence and power, looked shaken for the first time. The Lost Canyon was not just a place of legend. It was the spiritual center of their tribe, a hidden sanctuary where their ancestors were buried. The idea of it being desecrated by miners and railroad men was unthinkable. "How long ago?" the chief demanded, grabbing the mercenary by his shirt. "2 days," the man gasped. "Maybe 3 by now. You're too late." Chayton looked at her father, her face pale. "The rider would have gone through Devil's Pass. It's the only fast way through the mountains." Jake's mind, which had been numb with shock, suddenly started working again. Devil's Pass. He knew that area. It was treacherous, but it was a shortcut. "I can catch him," Jake said, the words coming out before he even realized he was speaking. The chief and Chayton turned to look at him. "You are injured," the chief said, gesturing to Jake's ankle. "It's just a sprain," Jake lied, ignoring the fiery pain. "Give me your fastest horse. I know those canyons better than anyone. I've herded cattle through every inch of that land. A railroad man's hired gun will stick to the main trail. I know the goat paths. I can cut him off." It was a long shot, a mad dash against time, but it was the only chance they had. The chief studied him for a long, silent moment. Jake met his gaze without flinching. He was no longer the hesitant, silent man from the watering hole. The last few days had forged something new in him. "Give him my horse," the chief commanded one of his warriors. A magnificent black stallion was brought forward. It was a powerful animal, bred for speed and endurance. Chayton stepped up to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and faith. "You do not have to do this, Jake." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is my fight now, too." She reached out and clasped his hand. "Be safe," she whispered. He swung himself into the saddle, gritting his teeth as a fresh wave of pain shot up his leg. He looked down at the assembled warriors, at the proud chief, and finally at Chayton. He gave her a single, determined nod. Then he spurred the stallion and rode like the wind, leaving the mesa and the rising sun behind him. The ride was a blur of pain and desperation. The stallion was incredible, eating up the miles with a ground-covering gallop. Jake pushed the horse and himself to the absolute limit. He navigated the treacherous terrain on pure instinct, his knowledge of the land his only guide. He left the well-worn trails, scrambling up scree slopes and down narrow, winding arroyos that would have been impassable for a lesser horseman. His ankle was a constant, throbbing agony. His body screamed for rest. But he ignored it all, his mind focused on a single image, a lone rider with a map that could destroy a people. By late afternoon, he was closing in. From a high ridge, he spotted him, a man on a bay horse, riding hard down in the canyon below. He was on the main trail, just as Jake had predicted. The man was pushing his horse hard, but Jake was coming at him from an angle, cutting across the switchbacks. Jake urged the stallion into a reckless, sliding descent down the side of the canyon, rocks and gravel clattering around him. He was gaining. The rider below must have heard the noise. He glanced back, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Jake thundering down on him. The man panicked. He drew his pistol and fired a wild shot that went wide. Jake didn't have time to draw his own weapon. He had to end this now. He leaned low over the stallion's neck, urging it to one final burst of speed. They hit the canyon floor just behind the other rider. Jake's stallion slammed into the bay's flank. Both horses went down in a tangle of flailing limbs. Jake was thrown clear, landing hard on his shoulder, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He rolled and came up, his Colt already in his hand. The other rider was slower to get to his feet. He was a wiry man with a cruel face, and he was holding a leather satchel in one hand. The map. He raised his pistol to fire, but Jake was faster. Jake's shot was true. The man grunted, dropping his pistol and clutching his shoulder, the satchel falling to the dust. Jake limped over, his gun steady, and kicked the man's pistol away. He picked up the satchel. Inside was a piece of parchment, covered in crude but accurate drawings of the canyons leading to a place marked with a skull. The Lost Canyon. He had it. He had actually done it. He turned his attention back to the wounded messenger, but as he did, he heard the unmistakable sound of multiple rifles being cocked. "Drop the gun, cowboy, and the bag." Jake froze. He slowly looked up. Lining the rim of the canyon above him were at least a dozen men, their rifles all aimed directly at him. They weren't Apache. They were rough-looking men in the employ of the railroad. And stepping out from behind them was a portly man in a fine suit and a bowler hat, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. "Excellent work," the man said, looking down at Jake. "You've saved my courier a great deal of trouble. I am Silas Croft, and I'll be taking that map now." Jake's heart sank like a stone. He hadn't intercepted a lone rider. He had ridden straight into the main force. He had led the enemy right to their prize. Silas Croft's men swarmed down into the canyon, disarming Jake and roughly tying his hands. Croft himself descended more carefully, a walking stick in hand, his expensive suit looking comically out of place in the rugged terrain. He picked up the leather satchel and pulled out the map, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "Perfect," he purred, looking at the parchment. "Absolutely perfect. The board of directors will be thrilled." He turned his cold, calculating eyes to Jake. "You, my friend, have been a thorn in my side. The colonel was a costly investment, but he assured me he could handle a single Apache girl. Clearly, he was incompetent." "He's dead," Jake said, his voice flat. Croft shrugged. "A business expense. Unfortunate, but manageable. His men, however, will be more than enough to secure this canyon for the railroad." He gestured to the armed men around them. They were hard cases, every one of them. "You'll never find it," Jake said, bluffing. "That map is useless without a guide." Croft chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think we will. My surveyors are quite resourceful. But you have given me an idea. Perhaps you would like to be our guide? A quick death is so much less motivating than a slow one." Jake's blood ran cold. He had failed. He had failed Chayton, failed her people. He had played the hero and led the villains right to the treasure. As Croft's men began hauling Jake to his feet, a strange sound drifted down the canyon. At first it was just a low hum, almost like the buzzing of insects. But it grew steadily louder, deeper. It was a sound of immense power, of something ancient and primal. One of Croft's men looked up, his face pale. "What is that?" Everyone fell silent, listening. The sound was coming from the direction of the Lost Canyon. It was a chanting, a chorus of voices rising and falling in a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. Croft looked annoyed. "What is this nonsense? Get a move on." But his men were rooted to the spot. their eyes wide with a superstitious fear. The chanting grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, seeming to come from the very rock itself. Then from the mouth of the lost canyon, they appeared. It was not a war party, it was a procession. Hundreds of Apache people, men, women, and children, emerged from the shadows. At their head was the chief, and beside him, Chayton. They were not carrying weapons, they were carrying torches. They formed a silent human wall, blocking the entrance to their sacred land. The chanting swelled, a sound of defiance, of spiritual power that was more intimidating than any weapon. Croft was momentarily stunned, but his greed quickly overcame his surprise. "What is this? A welcoming party?" he sneered. "Get them out of the way. Fire a few warning shots if you have to." His men hesitated, clearly unnerved by the silent, watching crowd and the powerful chanting. "I said fire!" Croft shrieked. One of the men reluctantly raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The chanting did not stop. The wall of people did not move. Chayton stepped forward from the line. Her voice, clear and strong, rang through the canyon. "This is our land," she called out. "This is sacred ground. You are not welcome here. Turn back now, or you will answer to our ancestors." Croft laughed out loud. "Ancestors? I have a dozen rifles that say your ancestors can't help you now. Men, advance. Clear a path." This time, spurred by their employer's rage, the men began to move forward, their rifles leveled. Jake struggled against his bonds, a feeling of utter helplessness washing over him. This was going to be a massacre. But as Croft's men advanced, the chief raised a hand. The chanting stopped. An absolute, profound silence fell over the canyon. Then the chief began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it carried an incredible weight, a deep resonance that seemed to make the air vibrate. He was not speaking English. He was speaking in his native tongue, his words flowing like a river. "What is he saying?" Croft demanded impatiently. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The chief was not pleading, he was not threatening, he was commanding. As he spoke, something began to happen. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to darken. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow canyon, whipping dust into the eyes of Croft's men. The temperature dropped suddenly. Dark, angry-looking clouds boiled up over the canyon rim, seemingly from nowhere. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the very ground. Croft's men stopped in their tracks, looking up at the sky in terror. "It's just a freak storm," Croft yelled, but there was a tremor of fear in his own voice now. "Keep moving!" The chief's voice rose, matching the rising fury of the storm. Rain began to fall, not a gentle rain, but a torrential, driving downpour. The dry canyon floor instantly turned into a muddy torrent. Another bolt of lightning struck the canyon wall, just feet from where the mercenaries stood. A massive slab of rock, loosened by the impact, broke free and crashed down onto the trail, narrowly missing two of the men. Panic erupted. The mercenaries, their nerve completely broken by this display of what seemed like supernatural power, threw down their rifles and fled, scrambling back up the canyon walls, desperate to escape the flash flood and the wrath of the heavens. Silas Croft stood alone, drenched and sputtering, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Come back, you cowards!" he screamed, but his men were gone. The storm raged for another minute, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The clouds parted, and the sun shone down once more. The flash flood receded, leaving the canyon floor steaming. The wall of Apache people stood exactly where they had been, silent and unmoved. The chief lowered his hand. Jake stared, his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. Had the chief somehow summoned the storm? Was it a miracle? Or was it just the most incredible, unbelievable coincidence in the history of the world? It didn't matter. Silas Croft, defeated and alone, stared at the silent Apache, then at Jake. His face was twisted with hatred. He reached inside his coat, pulling out a small Derringer pistol. "If I can't have this canyon," he hissed, "then no one will." He aimed the pistol not at the chief, but at Chayton. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Jake saw the flash from the tiny barrel. He saw Chayton's eyes widen in shock. He threw his body forward, his hands still tied behind his back. He didn't think. He just reacted. He slammed into Chayton, knocking her out of the path of the bullet. But he felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his side. He collapsed to the ground, the world going gray at the edges. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Chayton's face, her eyes wide with horror as she knelt over him, screaming his name. The pain was a distant fire, the voices around him a muffled echo. Jake drifted in a sea of darkness, surfacing for brief, agonizing moments of consciousness. He remembered flashes, the scent of burning herbs, the low, rhythmic beat of a drum, Chayton's hand holding his, her cool touch an anchor in the storm of his fever. He remembered the face of the chief, looking down at him with an expression of deep concern. He had been taken to their village, a hidden settlement nestled deep within the sacred canyon. The bullet had gone clean through, but he had lost a lot of blood, and the wound had become infected. For days, he hovered between life and death. The tribe's medicine man worked over him, applying poultices and chanting ancient prayers, while Chayton refused to leave his side. She cleaned the wound, forced broth between his lips, and spoke to him in low, gentle tones, telling him stories of her people, as if her voice alone could pull him back from the brink. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to heal. The fever broke. The pain receded to a dull, manageable ache. One afternoon he opened his eyes and the world was clear. Chayton was sitting beside him, weaving a basket. When she saw he was awake, a wave of relief washed over her face, so powerful it was like seeing the sun. "You're back," she whispered. "Did we win?" he rasped, his throat dry. She smiled. "We won." She told him what had happened. After he was shot, the Apache warriors had seized Silas Croft. He was given a trial, and the tribe's council, in an act of what they considered justice, banished him into the desert on foot, with only a single gourd of water. He was never seen again. The map was burned. The lost canyon was safe. In the weeks that followed, Jake regained his strength. He was treated not as an outsider, but as an honored guest. He learned the ways of Chayton's people, their customs, their deep connection to the land. He saw the treasure of the lost canyon, and it wasn't gold. It was a series of caves whose walls were covered in ancient paintings, a library of his people's history going back 1,000 years. That was the real gold. The Colonel and Croft had been after, the destruction of a culture. The silence that had defined Jake's life began to fill with new sounds. Children's laughter, the rhythm of the drum, the telling of stories around a communal fire. He learned to speak their language, and he found that he had more words in him than he ever thought possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls, he and Chayton walked to the river's edge. "You are healed now," she said quietly. "You are free to go. The chief has offered you horses, supplies, whatever you need." Jake looked at her. He thought of the empty, dusty trail that had once been his whole world. He thought of the lonely nights and the silent days. That life seemed like a distant dream, a story about someone else. "I don't want to go," he said. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers intertwined with his. It was the first time he had ever willingly initiated a touch. "At the watering hole," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "you asked to ride with me under the burning sun. I thought you were asking for a day, maybe a week. But what if you were asking for a lifetime?" Chayton looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the twilight. "A name is given when it is needed," she said, echoing her own words from that first day. "I think it is time I knew your name. Not just Jake, your full name." He realized with a jolt that he had never told her. No one had used his family name in years. "It's Coleman," he said. "Jacob Coleman." "Jacob Coleman," she repeated softly. "My people have no word for goodbye. We only say, until we see each other again. But I do not wish to say that to you. I wish for you to stay, to build a life here, with me." The quiet man, the lonely cowboy, who had never known love, had found it in the most unexpected place. He had faced down mercenaries and mountain lions. He had crossed deserts and outrun death. But this was the most courageous thing he had ever done. "Chayton," he said, his heart full. "I think I've been riding toward you my whole life." Their story became a legend, told around the fires for generations to come. The tale of the silent man who found his voice and the falcon girl who saved her people. They lived a long, full life in the sacred canyon, their love a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with a simple, daring question. Their love story was carved into the heart of the Wild West, a powerful reminder that courage and kindness can change the world. If you were moved by Jake and Chayton's journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories. And let us know in the comments below, what was the most shocking twist for you?